Welcome to Cafe Tales. Tonight we journey to the Vienna State Opera House in the early 1940s, where Poirot and Captain Hastings find themselves drawn into a mystery as dramatic as any performance on stage. When a celebrated soprano vanishes without a trace, the great detective must unravel a web of secrets hidden behind the glittering facade of operatic society. This is A Song Before Dying, a tale of music and murder told in tribute to Agatha Christie's brilliant legacy. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you are listening from tonight. If this story captivates your imagination, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel. Now settle in with your favorite drink and let the curtain rise on our mysterious tale. Chapter 1. The Prima Donna's Last Aria. It was my friend Hercule Poirot who suggested the evening at the Vienna State Opera House, a suggestion I was to regret most bitterly in the days that followed. We had arrived in Austria's capital on what Poirot termed a little holiday for the mind, though I suspected even then that his idea of mental relaxation differed considerably from my own. Mon ami Hastings, he had said that afternoon, as we settled into our hotel overlooking the Ringstrasse. Tonight we shall feast not merely upon the voice of the divine Elizabeth Kirsch, but upon human nature itself. Opera. It is the perfect laboratory for the study of passion. N'est-ce pas? I confess I was looking forward to a simple evening's entertainment. The war clouds gathering across Europe had cast a shadow over our travels, and the thought of losing myself in Mozart's sublime melodies seemed precisely what my troubled spirits required. The pre-performance reception in the opera house's gilded marais salon buzzed with the particular energy that surrounds great artists. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across walls adorned with portraits of Vienna's musical legends, while distinguished patrons sipped champagne and spoke in hushed, reverent tones about the evening's anticipated triumph. Elizabeth Kirsch held court at the salon's center like a queen receiving homage. She was not perhaps conventionally beautiful. Her features were too strong, her presence too commanding for mere prettiness, but she possessed that indefinable magnetism that transforms a woman into a force of nature. Her dark hair was swept into an elaborate chignon, and diamonds glittered at her throat above a gown of midnight blue silk that seemed to capture and reflect the very essence of musical drama. Poirot, her voice, even in conversation, carried the rich resonance that had made her famous throughout Europe. How marvelous that you honor us with your presence. Vienna has heard whispers of your remarkable talents. My friend's chest visibly swelled with pleasure. Madame Kirsch, the honor is entirely mine. To witness artistry of your caliber, it is a privilege beyond price. She laughed, a sound like silver bells. Such gallantry! And this must be your companion, the famous Captain Hastings. As introductions were made, I observed the small court that perpetually surrounded Madame Kirsch. Her manager, Herr Wolfgang Brenner, hovered nearby with the anxious devotion of a father watching his daughter's debut, a small, neat man with prematurely gray hair and worried eyes. He seemed to anticipate her every need before she voiced it. Elizabeth must not overtax herself, he murmured to anyone who would listen. The performance tonight, Die Zauberflöte, it demands everything she has to give. The tenor. Carlo Benedetti stood somewhat apart, his handsome face bearing an expression of barely concealed resentment. When Madame Kirsch laughed at some witticism of Poirot's, Benedetti's jaw tightened noticeably. She saves her warmest smiles for strangers, he muttered to his companion, just loudly enough to be overheard. Those who share her stage apparently merit less consideration. Near the wall, almost invisible in her plain black dress, stood a woman I initially took for one of the opera house staff. Only when Madame Kirsch called out, "Anna, my wrap," did I realize she was the prima donna's personal maid. Anna Hoffman moved with quiet efficiency to adjust her mistress's shawl, her pale, unremarkable face betraying no emotion whatsoever. The most intriguing member of the entourage proved to be Ingrid Müller, Madame Kirsch's understudy. A young woman of perhaps 25, with corn silk hair and eager blue eyes, she hung upon her mentor's every word with an intensity that was almost painful to witness. "Elizabeth has been everything to me," she confided breathlessly when introduced. "Without her guidance, her generosity in sharing her knowledge, I would still be singing in church choirs in Salzburg." Madame Kirsch's smile in response seemed oddly cold. "Ingrid exaggerates my influence. Talent will always find its way, will it not? Though perhaps not always in the direction one expects." The words were pleasant enough, but something in their delivery made young Ingrid's cheeks flush crimson. As the evening progressed, I found myself observing these relationships with growing fascination. Poirot, I noticed, was doing the same, his green eyes missing nothing as conversations swirled around us. "You are very quiet tonight, madame," he observed to Elizabeth during a momentary lull. "For one about to give what I am certain will be a performance of transcendent beauty." For just an instant, her brilliant smile flickered. "One grows weary of constant performance, Monsieur Poirot. Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to simply disappear, to step away from all of this." She gestured gracefully at the assembled company. "But surely," I interjected, "you would never wish to abandon such adoring audiences." Her laugh was brittle. "Adoring? Yes, they adore Elizabeth Kirsch, the voice, the image, the legend. But do any of them see the woman beneath? Do any of them care what she suffers, what she sacrifices, what debts she must pay?" The words hung in the air like a discordant note, and I saw several of her companions exchange glances. Herr Brenner stepped forward quickly. "Elizabeth, my dear, you must not speak so. The performance, we should prepare." She turned to him with a sudden dazzling smile that seemed to chase away the shadows. "Of course, Wolfgang. Forgive me, everyone. Pre-performance nerves, nothing more. The Queen of the Night waits for no one, not even her humble servant." As she swept from the salon in a rustle of silk and perfume, Anna Hoffman following silently in her wake, I found myself strangely unsettled by the entire exchange. "Remarkable woman," I commented to Poirot as we made our way to our box seats. "Indeed," he replied thoughtfully. "Most remarkable. Tell me, Hastings, what did you observe of the relationships in that little scene?" Before I could answer, the lights dimmed, and Mozart's immortal music began to weave its spell over the expectant audience. But even as I settled back to enjoy the evening's entertainment, I could not shake the feeling that I had witnessed something significant, though what, I could not have said. Chapter 2. The Empty Dressing Room. The overture had concluded, and the magnificent crimson curtain should have risen upon the first act of Mozart's masterpiece. Instead, it remained stubbornly closed while a growing murmur of confusion rippled through the expectant audience below. From our box seat, I watched as several black-clad figures scurried about the stage area, like ants whose nest had been disturbed. The orchestra, having completed their introduction, sat in awkward silence, their instruments gleaming mutely under the stage lights. "Most irregular," I muttered to Poirot, consulting my pocket watch. "We're already 10 minutes past the scheduled beginning." My friend leaned forward in his seat, his egg-shaped head tilted at that particular angle which indicated his keen interest had been aroused. "Observe, mon ami, The conductor. See how he turns repeatedly toward the wings, his baton raised and lowered with increasing agitation. This is not merely a matter of stage fright or temperament. Indeed, Maestro Hoffmann appeared distinctly distressed, mopping his brow with a large handkerchief despite the evening's coolness. He engaged in animated conversation with what appeared to be the stage manager, their gestures becoming more emphatic by the moment. A gentleman in evening dress emerged from the wings and approached the conductor's podium. The audience fell, silent as he raised his hands for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice carried clearly through the vast auditorium, "we regret to inform you that, due to an unexpected indisposition of our prima donna, tonight's performance must be delayed. We ask for your patience while we resolve this matter." The announcement was met with a rising tide of disappointed murmurs and scattered protests. Around us, elegantly dressed patrons began to shift restlessly in their seats, consulting programs, and engaging in heated speculation. "Indisposition?" I said to Poirot. "But she seemed perfectly well at the reception not 2 hours ago." "Précisément," replied my friend, his green eyes narrowing. "Most curious, is it not? Come, Hastings, let us discover what has become of the divine Madame Kirsch." Making our way through the ornate corridors behind the opera house proper, we encountered increasing chaos. Stagehands rushed about with harried expressions, while musicians from the orchestra stood in small groups, smoking and conversing in worried whispers. Poirot's reputation preceded him even here, and it was not long before Herr Brenner appeared, his face pale and drawn with anxiety. "Monsieur Poirot!" he exclaimed, grasping my friend's arm. "Thank heaven you are here. Elizabeth, she has vanished. Simply vanished into thin air." "Herr Brenner," Poirot said soothingly, "tell me, if you please, exactly what has occurred." The manager's hands trembled as he lit a cigarette. "She left us at the reception, as you saw, to prepare for the performance. This was at 7, her usual time. Anna went with her to the dressing room to assist with the costume and makeup. Elizabeth is always precise about her preparations. Die Zauberflöte requires nearly an hour for the complete transformation." He drew deeply on his cigarette before continuing. "At 20 minutes past 8, young Fritz, one of the callboys, went to escort her to the wings for her entrance. The dressing room door was locked from the inside, but when he knocked there was no response. We assumed she was in deep concentration. You know how artists can be before a crucial scene." "But surely," I interjected, "when the overture ended and she failed to appear—" "That is when we broke down the door," Brenner replied miserably. "The room was empty, Monsieur Poirot, empty. Her street clothes lay discarded. Her stage costume was gone. But Elizabeth herself, gone." He spread his hands helplessly. "And her maid, this Anna Hoffmann, also vanished. We have searched everywhere, the entire building, every room, every corridor. It is as if they simply dissolved into the very walls." Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. "Most fascinating. Tell me, this dressing room, it has but one entrance?" "Yes, and as I said, it was locked from within. There is a small window, but it looks out onto a sheer wall 3 stories above the street. Quite impossible as a means of escape." "Nevertheless," said Poirot firmly, "we must examine this room most carefully. Lead on, if you please." "Elizabeth?" Kirsch's dressing room was everything one might expect of a prima's private sanctum. Rich burgundy velvet draped the walls, while elaborate mirrors surrounded a dressing table laden with cosmetics, powders, and the tools of theatrical transformation. The air still held a lingering trace of her distinctive perfume, something exotic and expensive with undertones of jasmine and sandalwood. Poirot moved through the space with methodical precision, his keen eyes missing nothing. Near the dressing table, I noticed lay an overturned bottle of French perfume, its precious contents forming a small dark stain on the Persian carpet. "Observe, Hastings," my friend murmured, kneeling beside the spot. "The liquid is nearly dry, suggesting this occurred some time ago." Yet Madame Kirsch was most particular about order and symmetry, was she not? Such carelessness would be most unlike her. On the floor near the window, a torn piece of sheet music caught my attention. The fragment bore part of the Queen of the Night's famous aria, the very piece Elizabeth was scheduled to perform that evening. More curious still was what remained upon the dressing table itself. Among the usual theatrical paraphernalia lay a strand of pearls, beautiful, lustrous, and obviously valuable. They rested carelessly beside an open jewelry box, as if hastily discarded. "Her lucky necklace," said a quiet voice behind us. We turned to find Ingrid Muller standing in the doorway, her face drawn with worry. She moved to the dressing table and touched the pearls gently. "Elizabeth never performed without them," the young woman continued. "She claimed they were blessed by some Bavarian saint. Nonsense, of course, but she was quite superstitious about such things. She would no more go on stage without them than she would appear naked." "Yet here they remain," observed Poirot thoughtfully. "Precisely why I am so frightened," Ingrid replied. "Elizabeth might abandon many things, but never these pearls. Something terrible has happened, Monsieur Poirot. I feel it in my very bones." As if summoned by her words, Carlo Benedetti appeared in the corridor beyond, his face flushed with anger, or perhaps wine. "Still no sign of our precious prima donna?" he asked with obvious sarcasm. "Perhaps she has finally done what she has threatened so many times, simply walked away from all of us who depend upon her whims." "Carlo," Ingrid gasped. "How can you say such things?" The tenor shrugged elaborately. "I speak only truth, my dear Ingrid. How many times have we heard Elizabeth speak of disappearing, of escaping this life? Well, perhaps she has finally found the courage to do so." "But the locked door," I began. Benedetti waved dismissively. "There are ways, are there not? Secret passages, forgotten doorways. These old buildings hold many mysteries. I would not put it past our Elizabeth to arrange such a theatrical exit. It would be quite in character." Poirot studied the tenor with interest. "You believe, then, that Madame Kirsch has staged her own disappearance?" "I believe Elizabeth Kirsch capable of anything that serves her purpose," came the bitter reply. "The question we should ask ourselves is not where she has gone, but why she chose to leave us all looking like fools before a theater full of Vienna's most distinguished citizens." With that parting shot, he strode away down the corridor, leaving us in uncomfortable silence. Poirot made one final circuit of the dressing room, his fingertips trailing along surfaces, his nose twitching occasionally, as if following some invisible scent. At length, he straightened and turned to me with that expression I had learned to recognize, part satisfaction, part puzzlement. "Come, Hastings," he said quietly. "We have learned what this room has to teach us. Now we must discover what secrets the rest of this ancient building may hold." As we left the dressing room behind, I found myself glancing back at those abandoned pearls gleaming under the electric lights. Whatever had happened to Elizabeth Kirsch, I felt certain that the answer lay hidden somewhere within these ornate walls, if only we possessed the wit to find it. Chapter 3. Death in the Fountain. Dawn was breaking over Vienna when the terrible discovery was made. I had spent a restless night at our hotel, haunted by the mystery of Elizabeth Kirsch's inexplicable disappearance. Poirot, characteristically, had remained at the opera house until the small hours, conducting what he termed a most illuminating conversation with the building itself. The telephone's shrill ring awakened me at 6. It was Inspector Miller of the Vienna police. His heavily accented English was tight with barely controlled emotion. "Monsieur Poirot must come at once," he said without preamble. "We have found the woman. She is dead." Within the hour, we stood in the opera house's central courtyard, where morning mist still clung to the ornamental fountain that served as the building's crowning architectural feature. The fountain, a Baroque masterpiece depicting Neptune surrounded by classical nymphs, had been transformed overnight into something far more sinister. Elizabeth Kirsch lay suspended in the shallow basin, her body floating face down among the water, lilies and ornamental carp. Even in death, she retained a terrible, haunting beauty. Her dark hair fanned out like seaweed around her pale face, and her costume, the elaborate gown of Mozart's Queen of the Night, billowed around her like the wings of some exotic, tragic bird. Inspector Miller, a competent-looking man with a carefully waxed mustache, gestured toward the scene with evident distress. The night watchman discovered her at dawn during his final rounds. A most shocking sight, as you can imagine. Poirot approached the fountain's edge with his characteristic mincing steps, his keen eyes taking in every detail of the grim tableau. I noticed his nostrils flare slightly, and he withdrew his own magnifying glass from his waistcoat pocket. "Shh," he murmured, leaning closer to examine the body. "Most curious?" "Inspector," he continued, "observe, if you please, the condition of the makeup." Indeed, even I could see that Elizabeth's theatrical cosmetics, while disturbed by her time in the water, remained partially intact. Her kohl-rimmed eyes and painted lips suggested she had been fully prepared for her performance when death overtook her. "Suicide, most likely," declared Inspector Miller with the confidence of a man accustomed to swift conclusions. "These artistic types, they are prone to dramatic gestures when life disappoints them. Perhaps some romantic entanglement or professional setback." "And yet," said Poirot mildly, circling the fountain with measured steps, "there are certain inconsistencies that trouble the little gray cells, n'est-ce pas?" He gestured toward Elizabeth's costume. "Regard, Inspector, the gown. It is elaborate, heavily beaded with multiple layers of silk and tulle. Such fabric, when immersed in water, becomes extraordinarily heavy. Yet see how the outer layers remain remarkably dry, particularly around the bodice and sleeves." I leaned closer and saw what he meant. While the lower portions of the dress were thoroughly soaked, the upper section showed only the dampness one might expect from mist or light splashing. "Furthermore," Poirot continued, producing his pocket watch, "the time factor presents difficulties. Madame Kirsch vanished from her dressing room at approximately 8:20 last evening. The fountain is visible from several windows throughout the building, and the night watchman makes his rounds every 2 hours. Yet the body was not discovered until our dawn. Where was she during those intervening hours?" Inspector Miller frowned. "Perhaps she wandered the building in distress, before taking this final step?" Poirot agreed diplomatically. "But observe also the position of the body and the curious absence of disturbance around the fountain's edge." I studied the scene more carefully. The ornamental stonework surrounding the basin showed no signs of struggle, no scuff marks or displaced decorative elements that might suggest someone had climbed or fallen into the water. At that moment, the night watchman himself appeared, a grizzled man of perhaps 60 years named Klaus Uber, whose hands shook visibly as he approached our group. "Mein Gott," he muttered, crossing himself. "To think that such a thing could happen in my building." 40 years I have watched over this place, and never. You made your rounds as usual last night? Poirot inquired gently. Chawal, exactly. As always. 10 cower midnight, 2 cower, 4 cower. The courtyard was empty each time, I swear it upon my mother's grave. And you saw nothing unusual? Heard no sounds of distress? Uber shook his head emphatically. Nothing, Menher. The building was quiet as a tomb, after the last of the search parties gave up and went home. Poirot nodded thoughtfully, then turned his attention to the fountain itself. He walked completely around its circumference twice, occasionally stooping to examine the decorative stonework or peer into the water from different angles. Tell me, Herr Uber, this fountain, it operates continuously? 9. The water is turned off each evening at 10 Bauer to prevent the splashing from disturbing the night's silence. I turn it off myself as part of my first round. Uh-huh. Poirot's eyebrows rose fractionally. So the water would have been still when Madame Kirsch entered it. I suppose so, yeah. By now, word of the tragedy had spread, and members of Elizabeth's company began to arrive. Herr Brainer appeared first, his face gray with shock, and what I took to be genuine grief. Behind him came Ingrid Müller, who took one look at the fountain and burst into tears. 9, she sobbed. Not Elizabeth, not like this. She had everything to live for, her voice, her art, her admirers. Carlo Benedetti arrived shortly thereafter, his expression carefully composed, but his eyes bright with what might have been excitement or merely shock. So, he said quietly, our nightingale has sung her final song. The harshness of his words drew sharp looks from the others, but he seemed unrepentant. Do not mistake me for a hypocrite, he continued. Elizabeth was a great artist, but she was also a deeply troubled woman. This end, perhaps it was, inevitable. You speak as one with intimate knowledge of the deceased's state of mind, observed Poirot. Pray, tell us more of these troubles you mention. Benedetti's face flushed. I speak only what everyone knew. Elizabeth had been different lately, distracted, moody, given to strange pronouncements about disappearing and escaping her life. Last night's vanishing act was entirely in character. Yet this, Poirot gestured toward the fountain, suggests something rather more final than a mere disappearing act. As the morning progressed, the police photographer arrived to document the scene, followed by the coroner's men with their grim equipment. I found myself studying the faces of Elizabeth's associates as they watched the proceedings, searching for some clue to the truth behind this tragedy. Anna Hoffman appeared last of all, her plain black dress and colorless face making her nearly invisible among the more dramatic figures gathered around the fountain. She stood apart from the others, her pale eyes fixed upon her dead mistress with an expression I could not quite fathom. When at last Elizabeth's body was lifted from the water and placed upon the coroner's stretcher, I noticed Poirot watching, this final member of the company with particular attention. But Anna's face revealed nothing beyond what might have been appropriate grief for a faithful servant witnessing her employer's tragic end. Inspector, Poirot said as the courtyard began to empty, I must inform you that I believe you are in error regarding the nature of this death. Miller turned to him with obvious irritation. Indeed. And what does the great detective conclude? This was not suicide, mon ami. Nor was it accident. Poirot's voice carried absolute conviction. What we have witnessed here is murder. Murder, most ingeniously planned and executed. The inspector's skeptical expression suggested he placed little credence in this dramatic pronouncement, but I had learned long ago to trust my friend's instincts in such matters. As we made our way back into the opera house proper, I found myself wondering which of the mourners gathered around that tragic fountain concealed the heart of a killer. Chapter 4. Secrets of the Heart. The afternoon following our grim discovery found Poirot and myself ensconced in the opera house's administrative offices, where Inspector Muller had grudgingly agreed to allow my friend to conduct his inquiries. The building, normally alive with the bustle of rehearsals and preparations, had taken on the hushed, mournful atmosphere of a cathedral following tragedy, Sauertag. First interview was with Herr Wolfgang Brenner, Elizabeth's manager, whom we found in his cluttered office, surrounded by contracts, correspondence, and promotional photographs of his deceased client. The man appeared to have aged a decade overnight, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled, and his hands trembled as he poured himself a generous measure of brandy despite the early hour. 23 years, he said without preamble as we seated ourselves. 23 years I managed her career, watched her rise from a provincial chorus girl to the greatest soprano of her generation. And now, he gestured helplessly at a framed photograph of Elizabeth in her most famous role. A considerable length of time to observe someone closely, Poirot remarked gently. Tell me, Herr Brenner, had you noticed any changes in Madame Kirsch's behavior recently? Brenner's laugh was bitter. Changes? My God, yes. For the past 3 months, she had become, how do you say, unpredictable, moody, secretive, given to long periods of silence followed by sudden bursts of almost manic energy. Can you be more specific regarding these changes? The manager drained his glass before responding. She began missing rehearsals. Elizabeth, who had never missed a rehearsal in 2 decades. She would disappear for hours at a time, offering no explanation for her absence. And the phone calls? Poirot's ears pricked up visibly. The telephone calls were unusual. She would receive them at all hours, and when I inquired about the callers, she would become evasive, sometimes angry. Once I overheard her speaking. To someone, her voice was frightened. I had never heard Elizabeth sound frightened before. I leaned forward with interest. Could you make out any of the conversation? Brenner shook his head. Only fragments. Something about keeping promises and the past catching up. When she noticed me listening, she slammed down the receiver and refused to discuss the matter. These financial pressures you mentioned last evening, Poirot continued, were they serious enough to affect Madame Kirsch personally? For a moment, the manager's face became guarded. Then, with a sigh of resignation, he opened a leather portfolio and withdrew several documents. The opera company is in severe difficulty. The political situation has affected our patronage severely. Many of our traditional supporters have fled the country or become reluctant to be seen supporting the arts. He spread the papers before us. Elizabeth knew this, of course. She had been performing without salary for the past 2 months, using her own resources to keep the company solvent. A considerable sacrifice, I observed. Indeed, but Elizabeth was passionate about preserving Viennese musical tradition. She often said the opera house was her true home, more important to her than any personal consideration. His voice broke slightly. Perhaps the strain was too much. Perhaps she saw no way forward and chose. Yet you do not truly believe in suicide, Poirot interrupted softly. Brenner met his gaze directly. No, Monsieur Poirot. Elizabeth was many things. Temperamental, demanding, sometimes cruel. But she was not a quitter. She would have fought to her last breath, rather than surrender to despair. Our second interview was with Carlo Benedetti, whom we found in one of the practice rooms, mechanically running through vocal exercises. The tenor's handsome face bore an expression of barely controlled emotion as he agreed to speak with us. "You wish to know about Elizabeth?" he said, his voice carrying the resonance that had made him famous throughout the German-speaking world. "Very well, but I warn you, the truth is not always pleasant." "We are prepared for unpleasantness," Poirot assured him. Benedetti ceased his exercises and turned to face us fully. Elizabeth Kirsch was a great artist, but she was also a destroyer of souls. She took pleasure in nurturing talent only to crush it when it threatened to overshadow her own brilliance. "Strong words," I remarked. "Can you provide examples?" "Examples?" His laugh was harsh. "I can provide a lifetime of them. 3 years ago, a young baritone named Friedrich Helm showed remarkable promise. Elizabeth took him under her wing, promised him leading roles, even hinted at personal interest. When he began receiving offers from other companies, she systematically destroyed his reputation through whispered campaigns and deliberate sabotage." "What became of Herr Helm?" Poirot inquired. "He left Vienna in disgrace, his spirit broken. Last I heard, he was teaching voice to shopkeepers' daughters in some provincial town." Benedetti's hands clenched into fists. "That was Elizabeth's way, to build people up, only to tear them down when they no longer served her purpose." "And your own relationship with the deceased?" The tenor's face darkened. "We were close once, very close. She promised me we would perform together at La Scala, that she would use her influence to advance my career internationally. Instead, she sabotaged my auditions while pretending to support me." "When did this occur?" 2 years ago. Since then, our relationship has been purely professional, though the hostility remained." He paused, seeming to struggle with some internal conflict. "Yet I would not have wished such an end upon her. Despite everything, she was magnificent." "You mentioned yesterday that she had spoken of disappearing," Poirot prompted. "Can you recall her exact words?" Benedetti frowned in concentration. "It was perhaps a month ago. She said something about vanishing without a trace, leaving them all to wonder. I assumed she meant her critics and rivals. Elizabeth enjoyed dramatic pronouncements. Was there anyone specific she might have been referring to?" "There were always mysterious letters arriving for her. Sometimes they would upset her greatly. Once I saw her burn several without reading them completely. And there was a man—" "Ah." Poirot leaned forward with interest. "Un homme mystérieux?" "I saw them together twice, always in secluded locations. An older gentleman, well-dressed, distinguished. They would speak in urgent whispers, and Elizabeth would seem, I hesitate to use the word, submissive, quite unlike her usual commanding presence." "Can you describe this gentleman more precisely?" "Tall, perhaps 60 years of age, silver-haired, with a carefully trimmed beard. He wore expensive clothing but moved with military bearing. They met once in the Stadtpark, once outside St. Stephen's Cathedral. Both times, Elizabeth looked around nervously, as if afraid of being observed." This was indeed intriguing information, and I could see Poirot filing it away in those famous little gray cells of his. Our final interview of the day was with Anna Hoffman, whom we discovered in Elizabeth's dressing room, methodically packing her mistress's personal effects into a leather trunk. The maid worked with the same quiet efficiency I had observed the previous evening, her movements precise and economical. "Forgive the intrusion, Mademoiselle Hoffman," Poirot said courteously. "We wish to speak with you about your mistress, Anna." Paused in her packing, a silk scarf half folded in her hands. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot. though I fear there is little I can tell you that would be of use. You were with Madame Kirsch when she returned to her dressing room last evening. Can you describe her mood, her behavior? She seemed agitated, more so than was usual before a performance. She kept looking at the door, as if expecting someone. Anna's voice was colorless, matter-of-fact. She asked me to check the corridor twice to ensure we were alone. Did she say why? No, sir. Madame Kirsch never explained her requests. I learned long ago not to question her wishes. How long had you been in her service? 5 years, monsieur. I came to her after my previous employer moved to America. Madame Kirsch required someone who could be completely discreet, completely loyal. And you were both. For the first time, something flickered in Anna's pale eyes, though whether it was pride, pain, or something else entirely, I could not determine. I served her faithfully, Monsieur Poirot. Whatever her faults, she deserved that much. What faults do you refer to? Anna resumed her packing, folding the scarf with mechanical precision. Madame Kirsch was complicated. She could be generous and cruel within the same breath. But she was also brilliant, and brilliance excuses much, does it not? As we prepared to leave, I noticed Anna handling Elizabeth's personal items with a strange combination of reverence and what seemed almost like satisfaction. When she thought herself unobserved, her fingers lingered over a particular photograph, a picture of Elizabeth with a young man I did not recognize. Walking back through the opera house's ornate corridors, I found myself pondering the contradictory portraits that had emerged of the dead woman. Elizabeth Kirsch appeared to have been equal parts inspiring and destructive, beloved and feared, victim and victimizer. The question that haunted me was whether these very contradictions had ultimately led to her death. Chapter 5. The Understudy's Ambition. The following morning brought with it a crisp autumn air that seemed to clear the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over the opera house. Poirot had requested that we interview Ingrid Miller in the rehearsal hall, where she now spent her days preparing to assume Elizabeth's roles, a promotion that had come at such a terrible price. We found the young soprano standing before a full-length mirror, practicing the gestures and expressions that would transform her from understudy into leading lady. Her reflection showed a woman of undeniable beauty, though of a different type than her predecessor. Where Elizabeth had been commanding and magnetic, Ingrid possessed an ethereal, almost fragile quality that seemed to speak of innocence and vulnerability. "Forgive me," she said, turning from the mirror with a slight flush coloring her cheeks. "I know it must seem callous to be rehearsing so soon after the tragedy. But the company directors insist that we must be ready to resume performances within the week." "There is no need for apology, Mademoiselle Muller," Poirot assured her kindly. "Life, as they say, must continue. Indeed, it is admirable that you honor Madame Kirsch's memory by ensuring her roles live on." Ingrid's blue eyes filled with tears. "She was everything to me, Monsieur Poirot. Not just a mentor, but I suppose I thought of her almost as an older sister despite the difference in our ages." "Tell me," my friend continued gently, "of your relationship with the deceased. How did you come to be in her service?" The young woman moved to the piano and sat upon the bench, her hands resting motionless on the keys. 3 years ago, I was singing small roles with a traveling company that performed in Salzburg. Elizabeth heard me during a performance of La Bohème. I was playing Musetta. Afterward, she sought me out. Her voice took on a dreamy quality as she recalled the memory. She said I had the spark, the indefinable quality that separates true artists from mere singers. She offered to take me under her wing, to teach me not just technique, but stage presence, dramatic interpretation, the secrets of commanding an audience's complete attention. A generous offer, I observed. More generous than you could imagine, Ingrid replied earnestly. Elizabeth arranged for my position here, personally coached me in roles, even helped with my costumes and stage makeup. She said she saw her younger self in me, before the world had hardened her. An interesting choice of words, Poirot noted. Hardened her? In what way? Ingrid's expression grew troubled. Elizabeth often spoke of disappointments, betrayals she had suffered early in her career. She said the opera world was filled with people who would smile to your face while sharpening knives for your back. She was determined that I should be better prepared than she had been. And yet, Poirot's voice was carefully neutral. Others have suggested that Madame Kirsch could herself be, shall we say, ruthless in her treatment of potential rivals. For a moment, something flickered across Ingrid's face, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. Then her features composed themselves into an expression of loyal defense. Elizabeth could be demanding, yes, exacting in her standards. But she was never cruel without cause. She paused, seeming to wrestle with some internal conflict. Though I will admit she had grown different in recent months. Different in what manner? More suspicious, more secretive. She began questioning my loyalty, my gratitude for everything she had done for me. She would make cutting remarks about ambition, about how the young always seek to replace the old. Ingrid's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Sometimes I felt she was testing me, waiting for me to reveal some hidden treachery. Did you give her cause for such suspicions? The question hung in the air between us, and I saw Ingrid's hands clench briefly in her lap before she answered. There was an incident, perhaps 2 months ago. Herr Brenner approached me privately about the possibility of taking on larger roles, perhaps even some of Elizabeth's secondary parts. He said the company needed to develop new talent, that Elizabeth couldn't carry the entire season alone. And you agreed to this? I saw no harm in it. Indeed, I thought Elizabeth would be pleased that her teaching had prepared me for greater responsibilities. Ingrid's voice grew defensive. But when she discovered the arrangement, she was furious. She accused me of plotting behind her back, of being ungrateful, of trying to steal her thunder. How did this confrontation resolve itself? Badly. Elizabeth forbade me from taking any additional roles without her explicit permission. She also... Ingrid hesitated, color rising in her cheeks again. She threatened to dismiss me entirely if I showed any further signs of what she called overweening ambition. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. A difficult position for a young artist with natural aspirations for advancement. Indeed, I began to feel trapped, torn between my gratitude for her past kindness and my own need to grow as a performer. Elizabeth seemed determined to keep me forever in her shadow, never allowing me to truly shine in my own right. Where were you on the evening of the tragedy, from the time you left the reception until the following morning? I returned to my lodgings after the reception around 8. I live in a boarding house near the Naschmarkt. Frau Kepp keeps a strict establishment and can vouch for my presence there. She met Poirot's gaze directly. I spent the evening studying scores for the roles I was meant to understudy, never imagining I would be called upon to perform them under such circumstances. You saw no one else that evening? Received no visitors or telephone calls? None. I retired early, perhaps by 10 most. The first I knew of Elizabeth's disappearance was when Herr Brenner telephoned the following morning to inform me of the tragedy. As our interview continued, I found myself studying Ingrid's demeanor with growing fascination. Her sorrow for her mentor seemed genuine, yet beneath it I detected something else, a barely suppressed excitement or sense of liberation. It was as if Elizabeth's death, while tragic, had also removed some tremendous weight from her shoulders. "Tell me," Poirot said suddenly, "what did you know of Madame Kirsch's personal life, her romantic entanglements, her friendships?" Outside the opera world, Ingrid's expression grew guarded. Elizabeth was very private about such matters. She rarely spoke of personal relationships, though I gathered she had been hurt badly in the past by someone she trusted. Anyone in particular? She once mentioned a young man, a musician, I believe, who had betrayed her trust in some fundamental way. She said it had taught her never to place her heart in another's keeping. Ingrid's voice grew softer. I think that may have been why she found it so difficult to trust my loyalty. She had been disappointed so many times before. Yet she continued to mentor young artists despite these past betrayals. Perhaps that was her way of trying to heal old wounds, Poirot suggested. By nurturing talent, by sharing her knowledge, she could create something positive from her pain. Ingrid's eyes glistened with fresh tears. If only she had been able to trust that those she helped truly wished her well. And did they? Poirot asked quietly. Did you truly wish her well, Mademoiselle Muller? The question struck, like a physical blow, and for a moment Ingrid seemed unable to respond. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. I loved her, Monsieur Poirot. Despite everything, the suspicion, the cutting remarks, the constant feeling that I was walking on eggshells, I truly loved her. She gave me a life I could never have imagined, opportunities that seemed impossible for a girl from a small Austrian town. But love and resentment can coexist in the human heart, Poirot observed gently. It is possible to be grateful to someone while simultaneously feeling stifled by their control over one's life. Ingrid's composure finally cracked, and she buried her face in her hands. Yes, she whispered. Yes, there were times when I hated her for keeping me leashed like a pet dog, never allowing me to run free. But I could never have... She could not finish the sentence, and we left her there in the rehearsal hall, her shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. As we walked away, I found myself wondering whether we had just witnessed genuine grief or the performance of a lifetime by an actress skilled enough to replace the great Elizabeth Kirsch herself. Chapter 6. Love and Betrayal. That afternoon found us in Elizabeth Kirsch's private apartment, a sumptuous dwelling in Vienna's fashionable Innere district. Inspector Miller had grudgingly provided us with access, though he continued to maintain his theory of suicide, despite mounting evidence to the contrary. The apartment reflected its owner's theatrical nature: rich burgundy velvet curtains, gilt-framed mirrors, and dramatic oil paintings depicting operatic scenes. Yet, as Poirot conducted his methodical examination, I began to notice subtle signs of disturbance that suggested Elizabeth's final days had been far from peaceful. Observe. Hastings, my friend murmured, indicating a writing desk position near the tall windows. The arrangement of papers, most irregular for one so devoted to order and precision. Indeed, correspondence lay scattered across the desk's leather surface in what appeared to be hasty disorder. Several letters bore foreign postmarks, while others carried the embossed letterheads of Vienna's most distinguished families. Among them, I noticed, were several envelopes that had been torn open with evident urgency. Tiens, Poirot, I exclaimed softly, withdrawing a particular letter from the collection. This is most illuminating, mon ami. The letter, written on expensive cream-colored paper, was signed with an ornate M and bore yesterday's date. Though much of the content was in German, I could make out enough to understand its threatening nature. It speaks of consequences, Poirot translated, his brow furrowed in concentration, of debts that must be paid, promises that must be kept. The tone is most urgent, most insistent. Blackmail, I suggested? Peut-être. Or perhaps something more personal, more intimate. He set the letter aside carefully. Come, let us examine the remainder of this correspondence. What we discovered painted a picture of a woman living under considerable emotional strain. Love letters from various admirers mingled with legal documents, contracts, and what appeared to be several urgent requests for money from individuals whose names meant nothing to me, but caused Poirot's eyebrows to rise significantly. More intriguing still was a small leather-bound diary hidden within the desk's locked drawer, a drawer that had been forced open with some violence, judging by the splintered wood around the lock. Someone has been here before us, Poirot observed, grimly. Someone who knew of this diary's existence and was most anxious to examine its contents. The diary's final entries made for sobering reading. Elizabeth's elegant handwriting revealed a woman tormented by guilt, fear, and what could only be described as consuming remorse. 15th October. He came again today. I cannot escape the past, cannot undo what was done. Friedrich haunts my dreams, his eyes accusing me of cruelties I cannot deny. 18th October. The letter arrived this morning. She knows everything, every detail of my betrayal, every moment of my selfishness. How can I face her accusation when I know it to be true? October. I spoke with M today. He says there may be a way, but the price is more than I can bear to pay. Yet what choice do I have? The truth would destroy everything I have built. 2nd October. It ends tonight. I cannot carry this burden any longer. Perhaps in death I will find the peace that has eluded me in life. God forgive me for what I have done, and for what I am about to do. Most curious, Poirot mused as we studied these revelations. The entries suggest guilt over some past action involving someone named Friedrich, and fear of exposure by an unknown woman. Yet the final entry, it could be interpreted as suicidal intent, but also as something quite different. How so? Consider the phrasing, mon ami. It ends tonight. And what I am about to do. These could refer to suicide, certainly, but they could equally refer to a confrontation, a confession, or even an act of defiance against her. Tormentor. We spent the remainder of the afternoon searching the apartment thoroughly. In Elizabeth's bedroom, behind a loose board in the wardrobe, we discovered a small collection of photographs that provided further insight into her troubled past. The eye. Images showed Elizabeth in her younger days, radiating the fresh beauty and innocent joy of someone just beginning their artistic journey. Several featured a handsome young man with sensitive eyes and an artist's delicate hands. In one particularly poignant photograph, Elizabeth and the young man stood together before a piano, their faces glowing with shared happiness and what appeared to be deep affection. Friedrich, I presume? I said quietly. Poirot agreed. And see here, this dedication on the reverse. He turned the photograph over to reveal an inscription in faded ink. To my darling Elizabeth, may our music together last forever. Your devoted Friedrich, June 1937. The tenderness of the message stood in stark contrast to the torment expressed in Elizabeth's recent diary entries. What had happened to transform love into such apparent guilt and remorse? Our search also uncovered a bundle of letters tied with black ribbon, hidden in the same secret compartment. These were from Friedrich, and their contents revealed a relationship that had progressed from professional admiration to deep romantic attachment. As I read through these intimate communications, a picture began to emerge of a talented but struggling musician who had fallen completely under Elizabeth's spell. His letters spoke of plans for their future together, of shared artistic dreams, and of his absolute devotion to both her and their musical collaboration. Yet the letters grew increasingly desperate as they progressed through 1937 and into early 1938. Friedrich wrote of difficulties securing positions, of doors being mysteriously closed to him despite his obvious talent, and of a growing sense that forces beyond his understanding were working against him. My darling Elizabeth read one particularly heart-wrenching passage. I know you have tried to help, but everywhere I turn, I find the same response. It is as if someone has poisoned the well of opinion against me. Why will no one give me the opportunity to prove my worth? The final letter in the collection was dated March 1938 and bore the desperate tone of a man at the end of his emotional resources. I cannot understand what has changed between us. Your coldness these past weeks has broken something fundamental within me. If I have offended you in some way, please tell me how I may make amends. Without your love, without hope for our shared future, I see no purpose in continuing this struggle. Mon Dieu, Poirot whispered as we reached the end of this tragic correspondence. The pattern becomes clear, does it not? A promising young artist, systematically destroyed by forces he cannot comprehend, abandoned by the woman he loves, driven ultimately to suicide. I finished grimly. And Elizabeth knew she was responsible. Indeed. But how? And why? These are the questions that torment the little gray cells. He carefully retied the ribbon around the letters. Come, Hastings, we have learned much here. But I fear the most crucial answers lie elsewhere. As we prepared to leave the apartment, I found myself deeply affected by the tragedy we had uncovered. Elizabeth Kirsch, the magnificent artist who had commanded stages across Europe, had apparently built her success upon the destruction of an innocent young man who had loved her utterly. The weight of that knowledge had clearly tormented her in her final days. But had it been enough to drive her to suicide? Or had someone else decided to extract a more concrete form of justice? Walking through the darkening Vienna streets, I could not shake the image of those photographs, the young Elizabeth, radiant with joy and promise, standing beside the man whose dreams she would ultimately destroy. Whatever the truth about her death, one thing was certain. The seeds of tragedy had been planted years before, in the fertile ground of love betrayed and trust broken. Chapter 7. The Truth Behind the Mask. The following evening, Poirot summoned all the principal figures in our investigation to gather in the opera house's ornate green salon. The room, normally used for intimate receptions and private meetings, had been arranged with chairs in a semicircle facing a small dais where my friend stood, his hands clasped behind his back in that characteristic pose I had come to associate with his most dramatic revelations. Inspector Miller sat in the front row, his expression skeptical but attentive. Beside him, Herr Brainer fidgeted nervously with his pocket watch, while Carlo Benedetti lounged with studied nonchalance in his chair. Ingrid Miller occupied a seat near the window, her face pale but composed. And in the back row, almost invisible, in her customary black dress, sat Anna Hoffman. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his accented English carrying clearly through the hushed room, "we gather tonight to resolve the mystery of Elizabeth Kirsch's death. For 3 days we have heard theories of suicide, of accident, of crime passionnel. But the truth, as is so often the case, is both more complex and more simple than any of these explanations." He paused, allowing his keen gaze to sweep across the assembled faces. "Let us begin with what appeared to be the obvious solution. Madame Kirsch, tormented by guilt over past actions, takes her own life in a moment of despair. The evidence seems compelling. Her recent melancholy, her diary entries speaking of guilt and remorse, her dramatic disappearance from a locked dressing room. Precisely what I have maintained from the beginning," Inspector Muller interjected with satisfaction. "Ah, but wait, Inspector. The little gray cells, they are troubled by certain inconsistencies." Poirot raised a finger. "First, the condition of the body. Madame Kirsch was found fully costumed for her performance, her stage makeup largely intact. Yet she had supposedly been in the fountain for many hours. The fabric of her gown showed a curious pattern of wetting, saturated at the bottom, merely damp at the top." He moved to a small table where several items had been arranged. "Second, the matter of the locked dressing room. How does one disappear from such a space? The door was locked from within, the window impossible as an exit. Yet Madame Kirsch and her maid both vanished without trace. There must be a secret passage, Benedetti suggested. These old buildings are full of hidden doorways. An excellent theory, Monsieur Benedetti, and one which I investigated thoroughly. But no such passage exists. The room's walls are solid, the floor above and below accounted for." Poirot smiled slightly. "No, the solution to the locked room is far more elegant than hidden passages." He picked up a small glass vial from the table. "Third, the matter of time. The fountain was observed to be empty during the night. Watchmen's rounds at 10, midnight, 2, and 4 hours. Yet the body was discovered at dawn. When precisely did Madame Kirsch enter the water?" "She could have reached the fountain between rounds," Ingrid suggested quietly. "Possible, mademoiselle, but improbable. For you see, the fountain's water was turned off at 10 hours each evening. Our night watchman testified to this. Yet, when I examined the scene, I noticed something curious. Watermarks on the fountain's rim that showed the water level had been higher during the night than at dawn when the body was discovered." Inspector Muller frowned. "Or what are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting that someone turned the fountain on during the night, allowed it to fill higher than usual, then turned it off again before dawn. This created the perfect conditions for staging a drowning that appeared to have occurred at a different time than it actually did." Poirot set down the vial and moved to face the assembled group directly. "But let us examine our suspects, shall we? Herr Brenner, devoted manager, facing financial ruin if his star performer died. His alibi places him at home with his wife during the crucial hours. Moreover, Elizabeth's death solved none of his problems, while creating many new ones." The manager sagged with visible relief as Poirot moved on. Monsieur Benedetti, the jealous tenor, resentful of Elizabeth's treatment, ambitious for her roles. Yet he too has a solid alibi. He was seen at Café Central until past midnight, drinking with fellow musicians. More importantly, Elizabeth's death brought him no advancement. The opera company has suspended operations indefinitely. Benedetti's tense posture relaxed slightly. Mademoiselle Muller, the understudy who stood to gain most from her mentor's death. Her alibi appeared unshakable, confirmed by her landlady and fellow tenants. Moreover, our investigation revealed that Elizabeth had recently recommended Ingrid for several prestigious positions with other companies. Hardly the action of someone she intended to harm. Ingrid's eyes widened with surprise. She recommended me, but she seemed so angry about my ambitions. Appearances, mademoiselle, can be most deceiving. The letters were in her desk, dated just 1 week ago. Elizabeth may have been harsh in her methods, but she genuinely cared for your future. Poirot's expression grew grave. Which brings us to the true heart of this matter. He returned to the table and picked up one of the photographs we had discovered in Elizabeth's apartment. Friedrich Helm, a young musician of great promise, beloved by Elizabeth Kirsch, destroyed by circumstances that drove him to take his own life. In March 1938. A collective intake of breath rippled through the room. Anna Hoffman, I noticed, had gone deathly pale. Our investigation revealed the tragic story. Friedrich's career was systematically sabotaged, not by Elizabeth, as his letters suggested, but by someone else entirely. Someone who had learned of their relationship and chose to destroy him as punishment for Elizabeth's perceived betrayal of another's devotion. Poirot's gaze fixed on the back row. The question that tortured Elizabeth in her final days was not guilt over Friedrich's destruction, but the terrible knowledge of who had truly been responsible. She had discovered the truth, you see, and the weight of that knowledge was destroying her. But who? Inspector Miller demanded. Who would have had such motive, such opportunity? Someone who loved her completely, someone who had access to her correspondence, knew her routines and habits intimately, someone who could move through the opera house unseen, possessed keys to all areas, could manipulate the fountain's water supply. Poirot's voice grew soft but inexorable. Someone whose devotion had curdled into something far more dangerous, the need to possess completely, to eliminate all rivals for the beloved's affection. The silence in the room was absolute. In the back row, Anna Hoffman sat motionless as a statue, her pale eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond the walls. The method was ingenious in its simplicity, Poirot continued. Elizabeth was, indeed, in her dressing room when she disappeared, but she did not vanish. She was killed there, quickly and quietly, by someone she trusted completely. The body was then concealed until the early hours of morning, when it could be placed in the fountain to create the illusion of drowning. But the locked door, Mueller protested, was locked from the outside. Inspector, Poirot said gently, the key was turned in the lock, then passed under the door, to create the appearance of internal security. A simple but effective deception that relied upon our assumption that locked meant locked from within. As the full implications of Poirot's revelation settled upon the assembled group, I found myself watching Anna Hoffman with fascination and growing horror. Still, she sat in perfect stillness, neither confirming nor denying the accusations that swirled around her like gathering storm clouds. Chapter 8. A Servant's Justice. The silence that followed Poirot's revelation stretched like a taut wire through the ornate salon. All eyes had turned to Anna Hoffman, who remained seated in the back row with the same statue-like composure she had maintained throughout our investigation. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant ticking of the ornate clock on the A-Chao mantelpiece. Then, with a movement so deliberate it seemed choreographed, Anna rose from her chair. Her pale hands smoothed the fabric of her black dress, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same colorless precision that had characterized all her previous statements. You are correct, Monsieur Poirot. In every particular, you are correct. Inspector. Miller lurched forward in his seat. Frau Hoffmann, I must warn you that anything you say will be used against you. Yes. Anna's lips curved in what might have been a smile. But I think it is time for the complete truth, do you? Not? Monsieur Poirot has provided an admirably accurate framework. Allow me to fill in the remaining details. She moved forward with that same unhurried gait I had observed so many times, taking a position near the window where the fading daylight cast her pale features in sharp relief. 5 years ago, I came to work for Elizabeth Kirsch, but that was not our first meeting. We had known each other before, long before, when we were both young, and the world seemed full of infinite possibility. Poirot inclined his head slightly. You were acquainted in your youth. We grew up in the same small town outside Salzburg. Elizabeth even then was the golden child, beautiful, talented, destined for greatness. I was... Anna paused, her fingers touching the plain fabric of her collar. I was invisible, the baker's daughter, useful for running errands, and completing tasks others found beneath them. Yet you became close. We did. Despite the difference in our circumstances, Elizabeth was kind to me. She would include me in her games, share her dreams of operatic stardom, even teach me simple arias when no one else was listening. Anna's voice softened with memory. And when she left for Vienna to pursue her career, she promised she would not forget me. The room remained hushed, every person present seemingly mesmerized by this quiet woman's transformation, from invisible servant to central figure in our drama. But Elizabeth did forget, as was natural. Her career blossomed while I remained in our small town, working in my father's bakery, caring for my aging mother, until I met Friedrich. At the mention of that name, Anna's composure flickered for the first time. Her pale eyes brightened with something that might have been remembered joy, or perhaps unshed tears. He came to our town in the summer of 1936, playing piano for a traveling theatrical company. Such talent he possessed, such sensitivity and grace, and he noticed me, plain little Anna Hoffmann, whom no one had ever seen as worthy of romantic attention. You fell in love, Poirot observed gently, completely, utterly. For the first time in my life, I understood what the poets meant when they wrote of hearts that beat as one. Anna's voice grew stronger, more passionate. Friedrich felt the same. He spoke of marriage, of building a life together in Vienna where his talent might flourish. But then Elizabeth entered the picture. She came home for Christmas. That year, already established as a rising star. Friedrich was performing at the local church's holiday concert, and of course, Elizabeth attended. The moment she heard him play, she had to possess him. It was her nature, to see talent and claim it for her own purposes. She invited him to Vienna, promised him introductions, opportunities, a chance to escape provincial obscurity. And he accepted. How could he refuse? It seemed like Providence, the answer to all his dreams. He promised he would send for me once he was established, that our engagement would be announced as soon as he could support a wife. Anna's laugh was bitter. I waited. Week after week, month after month, I waited for letters that came. Less and less frequently, filled with growing desperation rather than triumph. Poirot moved closer. Elizabeth had seduced him, body and soul. She made him dependent upon her approval, her guidance, her affection. And when she tired of him, as she inevitably did, she cast him aside like a broken toy. Anna's voice grew flat, emotionless. But not before she had systematically destroyed every opportunity he might have had to succeed independently. She sabotaged his career. Worse, she used her influence to have him blacklisted from every major venue in Austria. When other companies showed interest in his compositions, she would whisper poison in the right ears. When he auditioned for positions, she ensured he was rejected. The final blow came when he discovered her true nature, Anna continued. She had grown bored with him, had taken a new lover. When Friedrich confronted her, she laughed and told him he should be grateful for the brief happiness she had given him. And so he took his own life. March 15th, 1938. He left a letter explaining everything. Elizabeth's promises, her betrayals, his realization that she had deliberately blocked every path to independence. The letter found its way to me eventually. Anna reached into her dress pocket and withdrew a folded paper, yellowed with age. I have carried it with me every day since, a reminder of what she took from me, from him, from the world, and you came to Vienna seeking employment with her. Not immediately. First, I had to plan, to prepare. I spent 2 years learning everything I could about Elizabeth's habits, her household needs, her requirements for personal service. When I finally applied for the position of her maid, she did not recognize me. I had changed much since our youth, and she had never truly seen me, even then. A remarkable deception, Inspector Miller muttered. Child's play, for someone she had never considered worth remembering. Anna's tone held no bitterness, only statement of fact. I served her faithfully for 5 years, waiting for the perfect opportunity, learning her routines, gaining her trust, becoming indispensable. And that opportunity came on, the night of her performance. She had discovered the truth about Friedrich's death, found some old letters, perhaps connected certain facts she had previously ignored. Her guilt was destroying her, not because she had loved him and lost him, but because she finally understood the magnitude of her casual cruelty. Anna moved to the window, gazing out at the darkening Vienna streets. She was agitated that evening, speaking of confessions, of making amends. I realized she intended to expose her own role in Friedrich's destruction, perhaps even implicate others who had helped her. I could not allow his memory to be further sullied by her public repentance. So you killed her. I gave her justice, the justice Friedrich never lived to receive. Anna turned back to face the room, her expression serene. A simple matter. She trusted me completely, never suspected that her devoted servant might harbor other loyalties. A quick injection with her own insulin needle. She was diabetic, you know. Then concealment of the body, until I could arrange the final scene. The fountain. Friedrich had always loved water. He said it reminded him of music, the way it flowed and changed and sang. It seemed fitting that Elizabeth should meet her end surrounded by the element he had found most beautiful. Anna concluded her confession. I found myself strangely moved by her dignity, her complete absence of self-pity or remorse. She had committed murder, yet there was something almost noble in her devotion to Friedrich's memory. Her patient years of service masking an unwavering determination to achieve what she saw as cosmic justice. Inspector Mueller rose heavily. To his feet, his hand moving toward the handcuffs at his belt. Anna Hoffman, I arrest you for the murder of Elizabeth Kirsch. Of course, Anna replied calmly, though I prefer to think of it as the settling of a debt long overdue. As the inspector led her from the salon, Anna paused at the doorway to look back at our assembled group. She was magnificent, you know. Even in her cruelty, even in her selfishness, Elizabeth possessed a kind of terrible magnificence. But magnificence does not excuse the destruction of innocence. The door closed behind her with a soft click. leaving the rest of us in contemplative silence. It was Poirot who finally spoke, his voice thoughtful and subdued. "And so we see," he said quietly, "how the sins of the past return to demand payment, with interest compounded. Elizabeth Kirsch achieved everything she desired: fame, success, adoration, but she could not escape the consequences of her casual cruelties." He gathered his coat and moved toward the door, pausing to look back at the ornate salon where so much truth had finally been revealed. "Come, Hastings," he said softly. "Our work is finished. Let us leave this place of beautiful music and ugly secrets to its ghosts." As we walked through the empty corridors of the Vienna State Opera House, I reflected on the strange justice that had been served within these walls. Anna Hoffman would face trial for murder, yet I could not entirely condemn her actions. In a world where the powerful routinely destroyed the innocent with impunity, perhaps her patient vengeance represented a kind of moral equilibrium, terrible, but somehow necessary. The great opera house fell silent behind us, its secrets finally laid bare under the light of truth. Thanks for joining us for A Song Before Dying. We hope this tale of intrigue and patient vengeance kept you captivated until the very end. If you enjoyed unraveling this mystery, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Cafe Tales for more classic detective tales. Until our next mystery unfolds, this is Ailey, signing off from Cafe Tales.